Hi, I'm Herman van Papenop, Head of Investment Research and Asset Allocation at Momentum Investments. In today's edition of Minutes with Momentum, I'm joined by Momentum Investments economist Sanisha to discuss the current trends in the global and South African economies. Sanisha, what is the overriding theme currently playing out in the global economy?
I think the main theme that we have to consider at this stage is the current Goldilocks environment that we are operating in. And when I say Goldilocks, here I'm really referring to economic conditions being not too hot or not too cold, but essentially operating in a well-behaved environment with ideal market conditions. Now we look at three key pillars in this Goldilocks environment, the first of which is growth. Now we've had some good positive surprises in both the Eurozone and Japan. This has also accompanied solid growth momentum in the United States. So together these three economies, with the remainder of the global economy, have continued on this path of globalized, synchronized economic recovery. The second pillar that we consider is inflation. And because economies are not overheating, we have had inflation not giving a very big response. In particular, if we look at the US economy, we have seen some signs that currently low inflation is not only cyclical in nature, but also structural, suggesting that inflation could be low for much longer. This all folds into the third pillar, which is really central banks' response to monetary policy. Now, if economies are not overheating, and if inflation is not really a problem at this stage, it's highly unlikely that central banks are going to attack interest rates in a more aggressive manner. So taking all three of these things into account, growth, inflation, and the outlook for monetary policy, it does give quite a favorable backdrop for risk assets.
What are the implications of this global outlook for emerging markets?
Well, emerging markets tend to do quite well in a global synchronized economic recovery. In this Goldilocks environment, which is generally good for commodity prices, we do find that there is an underpin for global trade activity.
Sanisha, does South Africa also benefit from this Goldilocks environment underpinning emerging markets?
Unfortunately, South Africa should have benefited far more. So if we look at that relationship between global economic growth and domestic growth, between 1994 and 2010, there was a very tight relationship. But since 2011, unfortunately, South African growth decoupled from more robust global activity. On a per capita basis, if we look at real growth, South Africa has been backtracking since 2015. So in essence, this means that South African consumers are actually getting poorer on average.
What has caused this divergence between the global and South African growth performances in recent years?
I believe that South Africa is suffering from a so-called confidence crisis. For businesses who are now looking at elevated rates of policy and economic uncertainty, they are quite reluctant to invest in the economy or even to hire new workers. This is also infiltrated down at the consumer level, where very downbeat consumer confidence prevents further spend in the economy.
What does this low growth environment imply for South Africa's fiscal position?
Well, in the absence of additional tax increases, we are likely to face a lot of problems on the revenue side, and this also throws a bit of a spanner in the works for our path for fiscal consolidation.
With this pressure on the revenue side of the budget, is there anything we can do on the expenditure side?
Well, the largest drag on the budget, at least from the expenditure side, is the government wage bill. So for every R1 that government spends on non-interest expenditure, 40 cents goes towards the civil servant wage bill. Now, public sector workers have been operating under a multi-year wage agreement, but this is set to expire in 2018. We've also had government speaking about a headcount freeze for some time, but in addition to this, they will have to take a very firm stance against additional wage increments that are above inflation in order to preserve fiscal sustainability of the medium term.
How does this all filter into South Africa's sovereign rating outlook?
Unfortunately, not in a good way. We are operating in an environment of extreme policy uncertainty. We are also in a very weak growth environment with very limited room for fiscal flexibility. Add to that is, of course, the state-owned enterprises, which are adding to the fiscal burden. Now, if we do not have any progress and meaningful progress on structural reform, and taking all of these factors into account, suggests to me that we do have a higher than even chance of a ratings downgrade by June of next year.
Is there any positive news for South African consumers in this very low growth environment?
I think that consumers can take one positive away, given that inflation is currently falling. In particular, food inflation is dropping. If we look at what's happened to the currency in the face of the political turmoil, as well as the notion of further ratings downgrades, the rand has actually held its ground. So if we look at where the currency is, reasonably well-behaved currency with the notion of falling inflation, it does open a window of opportunity for the Reserve Bank to consider cutting interest rates over the next 2 quarters.
To summarize then, there's currently a very supportive global economic backdrop in place, but unfortunately South Africa's growth is not benefiting from this due to a poor domestic political and policy environment eroding confidence. This has negative implications for South Africa's fiscal position and the sovereign ratings outlook. But fortunately, a falling inflation trend provides the South African Reserve Bank with the opportunity to cut interest rates further in the coming quarters.